So this here is the Traxxas TRX3. This buggy was made in 1993, and it was basically the last competition level two-wheel drive buggy that Traxxas made. You could say that technically speaking the Traxxas TCP was their last competitive buggy, but really the TCP is just a variation of the TRX3. It's actually exactly the same car, but it came with more parts. It came with, I think, both white and black suspension arms. It came with long and short front shocks. It came with dog bones and these universal type joints in the back. But otherwise, it was the same car. It just came with more parts to give you more setup options. But otherwise, it was a TRX3. So what makes the TRX3 special or interesting in my view is on the one hand, it's somewhat rare. You don't see these very often. They're pretty uncommon. They're hard to find. But I do like that it's a pretty smooth car. I know a few people that have owned and run TRX3s, and they really like it. They considered it to be their favorite car from that period of time. It was really great on rough tracks. It was very easy to drive quickly without difficulty. The shocks on the TRX3 are very smooth, much smoother than AE shocks from the same time period. And even AE shocks from the early 90s were pretty good. They weren't bad. But I think probably the fact that these shocks have a rubber bladder at the top, so they're not aerated shocks. That tends to make any type of shock with a rubber bladder smoother. So even the older Tamiya plastic body shocks that had rubber bladders on the inside, like on the TA02 or the Manta Ray or something, they actually were pretty smooth shocks, even though the shocks themselves were plastic. This is kind of the same deal here. The seal assembly on the shocks is quite a lot like what you had on the old AE shocks. You'd have like a plastic bushing, and then an O-ring, another plastic bushing, and an O-ring, and another plastic bushing. I don't know if they were plastic or Teflon, but it was the same kind of seal and bushing order, if you will, in the bottom seal assembly. The only difference being that on the old AE shocks, you would put all that onto a little plastic rod and pop it in from the inside of the shock body. On the Traxxas shocks, you would put everything in from the bottom, and then there was this C-clip that you'd have to attach under in this sort of the inner lip here on the bottom of the shock body. And I've done that a few times on other older shocks, and it's a real pain to manipulate that C-clip. And if you have like tweezers or something, you can do that. But I've had tweezers that actually bent under the spring force load when you try to compress that C-clip to remove the seal assembly. So it's not the best way to assemble a shock, but once they're assembled, they're very, very nice. The plastics themselves are beefy and relatively dense, so it would be pretty difficult to break parts on this car. The only demerit that I would give it is that it comes with all Phillips head screws everywhere on the chassis. And I had heard that these screws tend to, whatever steel they use wasn't so great, and the screws tend to strip easily. But, it's easily replaced. You can get hex head screws all around. It's not really a big deal. But it would be nice if it had come with hex screws. Okay, so what else is interesting about this car? The gearbox is especially interesting. I don't have the TRX3 manual, so I had to look it up online. But I did find, information about this gearbox, and two things stand out about it. Even though it's a conventional 3-gear gearbox, very similar to the Stealth gearbox on an RC10, the differential is a little bit different. It does not assemble in quite the same way. It has these kind of larger metal housings on either side of the diff outdrive, and they assemble in such a way so that there's a hole in those metal housings, and if you slot like a hex driver through those holes, if you align them correctly, then you can adjust the diff that way. And that's how the diff adjusts here. So there's this little screw right here, and if you want to adjust the diff, you just take that screw out, and then you put in like a 0.05 inch hex driver down, and you rotate the left and right wheels until the holes inside line up, and then that hex driver just slots right in. And then once it's there, you hold it there, and then you rotate the right wheel either forward or backward to tighten or loosen the diff. So this is actually, it's a pretty cool way of being able to adjust the diff without removing any parts. You just move this little screw here. On the RC10, you'd have to, on this side, pop off one of these ball cups and, maybe remove the wheel for clearance, and then put a 5/64 inch hex driver in from this side and tighten or loosen it. And each time you pop off a ball cup and pop it back on, it gets a little weaker. So here you don't have to worry about that. So that's kind of neat. Kyosho had a different solution with their SST gearbox on the Pro X. In this gearbox, the diff was mounted in the middle up here rather than on the bottom here. And by doing that, you would have direct access to the thrust bolt from the side of the gearbox. So again, you wouldn't have to take anything apart. You just remove a little cap that's on a hole over here, and you stick your hex driver in, and you tighten or loosen the diff that way. So it was a different design, but both Kyosho and Traxxas had made efforts to give the user a way of adjusting their ball diff without having to remove parts. Okay, and this is in contrast to the RC10 World's car, which is those two guys right there, which is a much simpler setup. The parts are more straightforward, but you have to take a few things apart to adjust the diff. The other thing that stood out about the gearbox is the slipper clutch. And the way it works is that it doesn't have actual slipper pads like what you would have on, say, the Kyosho kit or the Losi kits or the associated kits. It has these little notches here. So I pulled up a useful picture. So this would be your spur gear, okay, that goes on to the slipper plate. And then you'd have these little red dots here. These are basically your slipper pad pieces. I forget the exact name of the part, but they're like these little cylindrical pieces, and you just slot them into the holes in the spur gear. And each of these surfaces generates friction against your slipper plate. So it's not a continuous pad, but you have these discrete pieces. And I suppose, maybe the intent there was to allow you to add or remove individual pieces here to give you more or less slipper action depending on how much traction you have on the surface you're running on. Maybe that was the goal. I would suspect that for modern applications where we're running much more powerful motors, this is probably not enough surface area to give you reliable slipper action. So you might want to figure out a way to run a proper full slipper pad from like an RC10 or something like that. And I'm sure people have done conversions on that, although I haven't quite looked into that myself. But I wouldn't be surprised if anyone has done conversions of that for the TRX3. But that's kind of an interesting, if not esoteric, design for the slipper. So that's what it is. The other thing about the rear that stands out, there's two things. Similar to the Kyosho Pro X, there's no upper brace here connecting the top of the rear gearbox to the top of the rear bulkhead. You may remember on the RC10s, they have an upper brace here. And depending on the type of kit you got, if it was like a Championship Edition or a Team car or a World's car, that brace there was either made of plastic or carbon fiber. And I think the idea with that chassis was that it would allow you to adjust flex. So if the brace is in there and it's like a carbon fiber brace and it's a thick brace, you would have minimum flex at the chassis. It's sort of at this sort of point in the chassis. And then if you remove the brace, or if you use like, say, the plastic brace, which is more flexible, you get a little bit more flex in the rear. So, you could theoretically use that as a tuning option, although most people I know that run an RC10 don't really bother fiddling around with that brace. They just run a carbon fiber brace. The other thing that stands out is the universal assembly. So most other two-wheel drive buggies you'll run have just a very basic either a CVA or a CVD setup with a dog bone that slots into a diff out drive, and that depending on whether you want like higher grip or lower grip, there's a difference between how a dog bone works and how this type of universal joint works. And I maybe I should save that for another video, but here they have these universal joints at both the diff out drive and at the wheel axle joint here. And all else being equal, this basically allows you to run pretty much any amount of droop that you want without risking any dog bone sort of popping out of a diff out drive, right? In other setups like on an RC10 or even say a Kyosho Pro X or a Losi XX, you can only run so much droop before that dog bone pops out. So this doesn't have that problem. You never will run into drivetrain failure of that sort as a reliability problem while on the racetrack. The downside is that these are all plastic parts, okay? So, they will slop out over time. Maybe if you're running a high power motor, maybe, these will snap. So, one would have to see. The other thing here is this piece here. It slots onto the diff out drive, but it doesn't. This scrub screw here doesn't tighten down just onto a flat spot in the diff out drive. It actually goes through a hole that's in this little metal output piece from the diff. So that's good. This means that this piece here won't slip against the diff out drive, under high torque conditions. So this is actually a pretty locked in drivetrain. It's pretty cool. I like it. I was also looking through the manual, the online manual, and I found that Traxxas had also sold, they included with the kit, plates to put under the rear hinge pin mounts to modulate anti-squat. Okay, so they gave you variations anywhere from I think like 0 degrees up to maybe 4 degrees or so of anti-squat, which is pretty cool because the RC10 Worlds car didn't have that. The Pro X doesn't have that. And I'm pretty sure the Losi XX doesn't have that either, but I'd have to check. So this is, at least from 1993, 1994 era cars, which actually precedes the XX. This was probably the only car available that allowed you to adjust anti-squat with an actual factory supplied part. Maybe the Schumacher Cougar 2000 also had that. They tended to over-engineer their cars, but again, I'd have to check. But at least for the stuff that was typically used in the US, this one had that tuning ability. The rear bulkhead also has quite a lot more holes here to adjust camber gain. So I would say more holes compared to the RC10. The RC10 team car and the Worlds car, they had a 3x3 matrix of holes out here, and then a single hole on the inside. And that single hole on the inside is what a lot of drivers use toward the end of that car's tenure, is that gave the lowest camber gain on tracks that were progressively increasing in grip level. But this gives you a lot more tunability with camber gain in that sort of regime than what you would get on the RC10. So all things considered, if I had a choice between running a car like this and an RC10 Worlds car, I'd probably end up choosing this, say 9 times out of 10, assuming that the parts availability was there, because it looks like there's more adjustability on the car, and it's easier to adjust things like the diff, and the suspension is much smoother. It's a really nice design. It's really a shame that Traxxas didn't keep going with their two-wheel drive buggy racing program, because this was an excellent buggy. I have heard that, because I'm not a Traxxas expert here, but the Traxxas Bandit is basically like a plastic version of the TRX3. And I have a friend who still runs his Bandit, and he actually runs very well with it in most races. So, if you want to get a TRX3-like buggy, then get a Bandit and put all kinds of aftermarket parts on it to make it, race-worthy. Or if you can find a TRX3, get one of these and replace every screw with hex screws, and you should be good to go. So I think that's it. I hope this... actually, one more thing. I almost forgot. Sorry about that. Steering rack does have Ackerman adjustment. You can see here there's a hole in the back that's not used, and there's a hole in the front that is used. So there's extra tunability there on the steering. And I think that's about it. Oh yeah, they also give you tunability for the spindle carrier height. Okay, so again, we'll compare it to the standard bearer, which was the RC10 World's car. The steering rack on the RC10 did not have any Ackerman adjustment, and the caster block on the old RC10 was just large enough to fit the spindle carrier, so you could not adjust the spindle carrier height. Here you can adjust spindle carrier height, you can adjust Ackerman, you can also adjust a little bit more on the front roll center, right? You can see, maybe if I go to the back here, it's a little bit easier to see. 2 holes here on the caster block, so I can increase or decrease the front roll center. There was only 1 hole there on the RC10 caster block. 2 camber gain adjustment options on the front. So really there's quite a lot of adjustability here on the TRX3. Probably among the more adjustable, definitely among the more adjustable two-wheel drive buggies from this era. Easily, hands down. So very, very cool car. I actually have a few of these. You know, I have this rule of 2 where I need to have at least one of them in new or new-like condition on a shelf in order for me to have a runner version of this. So I have one of these with fiberglass, the white fiberglass upper and lower decks that maybe one day I'll turn into a runner after I get a few more spare parts to you know, compile together. Yeah, so I think that's it. I hope you found this interesting, and thanks for watching.